happens lately is more and more often, unfortunately, missing children or abducted children or child murders. And in those charts, Nessus shows up, and it's predominantly featured against other planets and in a negative way. And one such example would be John Benet Ramsey, and I put her chart in here. What it tells me in her chart, there's all this controversy, was she molested or not? She absolutely was. I don't know, I know why they're covering it up, but it's predominantly featured that there is some sort of molestation in her chart. And I've seen it in the charts of abducted children as well, which is a shame, but that's what Nessus. In astrology, we start to boil things down. We don't look at the whole myth, obviously, but things that stand out, people work with them, and empirically we develop definitions of the different asteroids. And then they turn up in the chart of a person when something like that happens.
There's an aspect of numerology to all of these. So they've counted each and every one of these asteroids, and based off of their position, I think that has a lot to do with how they've named them. So there's an aspect of numerology to all of the Greek gods and all these Greek figures. And I think what they're doing is they're matching them up. Now, the Greek mythology itself was sort of like this poetic conversation with nature. And in using the numerology between the two, I think that's where you get that linkage that you were talking about, is like they're naming these things based off of, intrinsic aspects to them. Yeah, there's the chart.
There it is. I'm glad you brought that up. I was going to do a slide. I thought, I'm getting too many slides in here. I didn't do it. But I did notice really interesting numbers coming up. I did a whole, I must have just pulled 25 examples of the dates of discovery. I don't know if that's when they were discovered, the dates they were named, and the dates they were made official. I got a batch of 11s and 13s and 17s in those dates. And I'm going to talk about one very important one in a little while. And I thought, wow, this is interesting. All this 13, 17, and 11, and but not enough of a sample to really say that that's what's going on. It may be, it may not be, but I did notice it. But I didn't want to veer off in that direction. I wanted to stay on, looking back into the nomenclature of these asteroids. So the reason I have this chart, this is a chart of the prime chart of John Benet Ramsey, which actually we're going to be doing a show on in the future.
Yes.
So it's kind of timely that this came up. I just picked it as a good example because I'm talking about Nessus, and it does refer to sexual assault.
Oh, I wanted to ask real quick. It was that Nessus? Did that one show up at all in the Smiley Face Killers too, or no?
I think it did in one of them. I think it did.
I was just wondering, because that would be wild if you had like...
I probably didn't mention it. If it only comes up once, maybe I don't. Yeah. But I did. I would have to go back over my notes and pull that. But it's in this one. What is also in this one is the asteroid Tantalus. And you can imagine the word tantalize comes right from that. Tantalus, I don't have much information on, but what we interpret it as in the astrological chart is something that is presented that you really want, and you feel like you can't have it. It's like a temptation, but it drives you, and you have to have it. And Tantalus was in Smiley Face in several of the charts because there was a sexual element to some of them. So Tantalus comes up here in John Benet Ramsey's chart, and she was very desirable to certain types of people that would want to pursue her, which ultimately led to her unfortunate death. So Tantalus is there with Nessus. I saw the two of them together. I was like, oh my God, there's no denying what happened to this poor girl. But the other reason I wanted to put this chart up like this was going around the outside. You see the chart around the outer circle, you can't read it, it's very small print. But these are all names of all the asteroids. Not all of them, I shouldn't say that. The ones that the software will pull, they're not all active. In order to be relevant to the chart, they have to contact another planet. They have to be configured in some way to an angle, which would be one of the specific houses. These are all in this chart. The asteroids are in every single chart because they're out there. Everything's out there. But all of these do not fit into John Benet's chart, only a few of them. But this is what you see, and this is the...
Well, a quick note about the asteroids real quick. There are a multiple asteroid belts in our solar system. And so these are sometimes in the outer ring or in the inner ring, because I think there's one between Earth and Mars, and then there's another one between Mars and Jupiter.
Mars and Jupiter, right?
So you've got these big, like these are barriers to our universe. So these really do have like an impact if you think about our consciousness being part of the whole. So
yeah, good point. Good point. Yeah, there's the Sybil belt, there's the Apollo belt, there's a bunch of belts. And what fits in, I think Tantalus belongs to Apollo. One of the other ones does as well. Bacchus, I think, does. So those are the names. And on the right-hand side is, I think there's about 100 listed there that the software will pull and tell you where it's configured in the chart. And it looks like a nightmare. It really isn't. You look quickly at where the planets are and check where they configure on the right. Those are 100. We actually have 8,000. There are actually 1.2 million. There are 8,000 that are named and identifiable to be worked with, which is why I kind of didn't want to start working with them at the beginning. It was like overwhelming. But I think the outside rim here are either 50 or 100. I will look at those. I will look at the ones on the right, because as bad as it looks, you learn to there's 10 planets. You look through them for the 10. Did they configure with the 10 in any way, and how? And it really isn't that bad. If you want to look up something that doesn't fall in here, like I was trying to find Ganymede, because Ganymede is very significant in certain incidents of crime.
Well, Ganymede is a moon of Jupiter.
Yes. Ganymede being symbolic of a kidnapped child, right, or often of a young boy who was molested, because of Zeus taking Ganymede off and bringing him in as his houseboy. Well, then he becomes the water bearer.
Zeus's father that did that. That was Kronos that kidnapped Ganymede. Did it. Right. Okay. And so, yeah, it was Zeus that ended up using that against him.
Oh, I see. Okay, so I had it a little bit backwards, but it was he was brought in as a houseboy, and he became Aquarius, the water bearer, because he was carrying water for the household. So he becomes Aquarius. Right. But Ganymede, in that sense of that myth, what happened to him, it shows a kidnapping. And I ran a crime chart recently for the very famous case of Johnny Gosch, who went missing in Iowa in the early 1980s, and that kind of set out the whole expose of the Franklin scandal. That got connected to the Franklin scandal, was later written about extensively. Nick Bryant and another guy. Yeah, it was big Ganymede. So Ganymede comes out in Johnny Goss's chart, which I looked up because that was, in my mind, I thought, I've got to look that up. That's one of the first instances of boys being kidnapped into these rings by perverts. And we didn't know that was going on back in the 80s. So that was very significant.
This makes me very curious about Epstein's chart.
I'll run it. Yeah, I'll definitely run that. Somebody else asked me that, and I didn't do it yet. So that'll light a fire under me for sure. So that one, Ganymede, I didn't go into too much, but I did talk about John Bonet. And, here's a really interesting one. Oh, no, before I get to that. Of the three fates, Clotho, Lachesis, and Atropos. Atropos turns up in these cases as well. It's also in John Benet Ramsey's chart. John Benet had, like I said, some really strong indicators of malfeasance. And also in the Black Dahlia, Atropos being the one who cuts the cord of life, the three fates. One spins the life, the second one measures it, the third one cuts it off. Right. And that's what Atropos does for the Black Dahlia and John Benet Ramsey. And so that was they're very clear and concise. I mean, when you look at planets are so general. You really have to funnel down what you're looking for. You have to look at the sign it's in and the house, and is it configured to other planets?
It seems like when these asteroids pop up, it's just like a 1-to-1 ratio. Like you get the exact thing once you know anything about their story, which is like, that's crazy accurate.
That's how I felt, why I fell in love with them. I didn't realize how useful they were in crime charts. They're so specific. Whereas if you're looking at Mars, like I said, it's violence, it's sexual desire, it's an accident, it's a gunshot, it's an explosion. It could be all these things. But you have something like atropos or atropos. That's the end of life. That's a death.
Right.
You know, you're not going to look at what kind of death. You're going to find that somewhere else. But you know that this person's cord was cut, which is what this.
Well, it's also a very interesting part of the story. It's their death that's the center of it. There are other aspects to different other stories, but in the JonBenet Ramsey case, the death mystery, right, is the central focus. Black Dahlia, wasn't she cut up or something?
Yeah,
and it was like a death of like basically a flower, you know? So it's like death is the central character in all of their crime stories.
That's right. That's right. That's exactly how I described it.
Would you say, BD, the asteroids act like a fine-tuning dial? And that you have these planets kind of telling you what's going on in the general vicinity, kind of like you're triangulating. And then when you have the asteroids come in, they kind of focus it down, like fine tune exactly what you're looking for. It almost sounds like that to me. That's why I ask.
Well, you hit the nail on the head, Lisa. And I love that you said fine tuning like a dial, because that's the shape. The zodiac chart is the shape of a dial. So, I mean, you just nailed it right there.
Reminds me of like a bank dial.
Right? Yeah, no, great job. I mean, perfect. It is a dial. Okay, here's where I start to make that detour. I come across the asteroid Phaethon, son of Helios. If you want to tell us a little bit about Phaethon.
Well, I know Helios, obviously Helios the sun, right? And so I'm not so familiar with this sun. I'm going to look it up real quick. Yeah, there's this concept of Helios, right? I know where he comes from, right? He comes from Thea and Hyperion, right? And Thea is the goddess of value. So she's sort of depicted as like laser-eyed, right? So she's got lights coming from her eyes. She actually creates intrinsic value. And so from that concept of value, that's where we get the sun, the moon, and dawn, which would be Eos, Helios, and Selene, right? And so to measure that down even further, like the dial, I'm sure Helios's son would take all of those concepts and sort of bring them into his own aspects. That's why we use Greek for psychology words, is because it just sort of all these different stories nail down into a psychological concept.
Yeah. What I got out of Phaethon, which really intrigued me, it was just so amazing. Discovered in 1983, the first asteroid to be discovered by spacecraft and not through a telescope. And the story I got in looking it up was that Phaethon wanted to ride a chariot. So took off on a chariot with horses, you know, racing all over the place, causing mayhem, lost control of the chariot. And Zeus had to strike him with a lightning bolt to get him to stop because he was destroying everything and running over people and stuff like that. So what we extract from that in astrology is that it is about someone who takes on responsibility that they can't handle and they mess it up. Right. And they also are reckless in their approach. They take on, get on a chariot and ride it too fast and destroy things. So I start to look at that, and I know that you can extract things down into modern terms. So I'm thinking, well, a chariot, okay, well, that could be a car. It could be a car accident. It could be somebody driving a car too fast. So I got this idea. I got to look up race car drivers. So I looked up the charts of two famous race car drivers. One's Jackie Stewart. He's a British race car driver, Formula One, very famous. The other one was Kyle Petty, good old Southern boy, NASCAR race car driver. And I looked at their natal charts, and wouldn't you know that Phaethon is extremely strong in both of their charts. Race cars, they drive fast cars. Sometimes that gets reckless. So I thought, well, there's Phaethon. That's right there, literally. And then in connection with crime, a while ago, I did a write-up on the murder of Diane Downs, who was a young mother who attempted to murder her 3 children in May of 1983. This was in Oregon. She had 3 young children. She was a single mother, and she had a boyfriend who didn't want children. So she decided that the boyfriend was more important to her than her own 3 children, who were all below the age of 10, I believe. And she went driving around with them in the countryside one night, riding around, trying to figure out what to do. So she finally decided she had to choose the boyfriend over the kids. She pulled the car over and shot her 3 children in the car. 2 of them died. One was permanently disabled, is now confined to a wheelchair, one of the daughters. Now, Diane Downs is now serving a life term in prison. She'll never get out. But Faithon was featured in relation to Mars, which was gunshots. She shot her children in her car, a vehicle, wow. The chariot, a vehicle. And
I bet there's an Icarus asteroid too.
Oh, absolutely. The Icarus, yeah.
And if you got them two together, you could actually predict what time would be the worst time for you to be in a car because somebody's careless driving.
Yes, that's a good observation. Because I did see an Icarus. You know where I saw Icarus was in the first plane striking the North Tower of World Trade Center.
Wow.
Icarus, flying